Attacks and smears. That's China's response to criticisms by the G7. Washington is driving a tougher line with Beijing as its military and foreign relations with the EU become closer. So where does that leave its European allies and their trade ties with Beijing? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. Beijing has reacted angrily to a statement by G7 leaders during their summit in Japan. The G7 communique included criticism of Beijing on human rights, alleged interference in democracies and tension in the South China Sea. But while relations between Washington and Beijing have sunk to their lowest in decades, China has grown to become the world's second biggest economic powerhouse. It's a vital trading partner that the European Union and many global industries depend on. So how can they respond as the United States ratchets up its stance on China, a position reiterated at the G7?
We are more secure with all the talk about China's building its military. It is building its military, and that's why I've made it clear that I'm not prepared to trade certain items with China. And when I was asked by President Xi why, I said, because you're using them to build nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, and I'm not going to do it. And we've now got commitment from all of our allies. They're not going to either provide that kind of material that allows them to do that. But that's not a hostile act. That's an act that says we're going to make sure that we do everything we can to maintain the status quo ante.
Well, China has reacted furiously to the G7 summit, lodging a formal complaint with Japan. Katrina Yu reports from Beijing on the reaction there.
China has responded angrily to the G7 summit in Hiroshima, accusing the group of smearing Beijing and distorting the facts. Firstly, Beijing denies that it's guilty of economic coercion, pointing fingers instead at the United States and what it says are unilateral sanctions. It's also condemned Washington for putting pressure on other countries to decouple from Chinese supply chains. On the issue of the East and South China Sea, Beijing says that it has always maintained maritime law and accuses the group of causing instability in the region. However, China has also refused to acknowledge the fact that much of the territory that it uses and claims as its own is also claimed by many of its neighbors. And finally, Beijing has attacked the G7 for expressing concern over Taiwan and human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Tibet and Hong Kong. It says that these are purely domestic affairs that the group should not meddle in, as well as other countries. Now, in the lead up to this summit, China has sought to discredit the G7, calling it a club of the rich, an anti-China alliance with little genuine interest in working with developing countries. However, despite its numerous criticisms, Beijing continues to maintain strong and important trading relationships with each of the G7 member states, including the European Union. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
While relations with the US and Europe have become closer over the war in Ukraine, trade between the EU and China has expanded rapidly during recent years. Last year, China was the EU's second largest trade partner after the US. Total imports and exports reached more than $926 billion. Well, China is the third largest destination for goods produced in the EU, accounting for 9% of the bloc's exports. Among the EU's top exports to China are cars and auto components and electrical goods. Some of China's main imports from the EU include telecommunication equipment and data processing machines. Well, for Europe, balancing the need to trade with China as relations between Beijing and Washington worsen presents serious challenges. European policy is to de-risk, that is, reduce exposure to China, and not decouple or sever their ties.
There is a very clear understanding here. No one is advocating decoupling, excluding China from global trade. That is being pursued by no one, and everyone is of the opinion that China should be able to develop well. At the same time, it is also important to watch closely that this is embedded in the framework of the international order we have. Part of that is that all countries must commit to respecting the international rules, and that policy must be conducted in such a way that there is security for everyone.
Well, joining me now are our guests. In Beijing is Einar Tangen, China Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute, a think tank. In London is Vicky Pryce, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And in Brussels is Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent for Europe at the New York Times. A warm welcome to all three of you. Thank you very much for being on Al Jazeera. Stephen, if I can begin with you, please. I mean, this has been described as one of the strongest condemnations by the G7. I mean, how surprised are you with the G7 statement, especially its directness towards Beijing?
Oh, I'm not terribly surprised. I mean, one fights about language constantly, and statements have a certain value. I wouldn't take them too seriously. But the United States is still the most powerful member of the G7, and Joe Biden has been quite tough on China. In a way, so was Donald Trump. I mean, there's a recognition in the United States that China is a peer rival, and it has ambitions in the Pacific which challenge American interests there. And Europe is caught, as you and your reporter said, in a more difficult place, but the European Union has also discovered with COVID, and also in a way with its dependency on Russia, that it doesn't want to be as dependent for trade, for goods, for supplies of important materials on China either. So the idea, pretty much following the Americans, is to try to protect key industries and key sources of raw material to de-risk while not destroying the important trade that you also described. It's a delicate balancing act. It annoys China. China feels encircled, but the West would say this is a response to China's actions and not coming out of the blue.
Vicky, can you just, I guess, describe the economic threat that is posed by Beijing, and just give us a little bit of context to the scale of China's economic power coming out of COVID-19, and especially, the use of the term that we've heard over the last couple of days, the so-called economic coercion that the G7 is accusing China of?
Yes, I think that's really quite interesting when you look at particularly the involvement of China in a number of countries, particularly developing countries, where it has been quite involved in infrastructure development, of course. And what we do know is that as a result of that, it has been able to be considerably more influential in terms of the way in which some of these countries operate. In addition, of course, we have the issue of trade with the West more generally, where, of course, with COVID, as you mentioned, I mean, the issues have been that supply chains have been very significantly disrupted, and a lot of what we needed to go into our car manufacturing, into the production of course, mobiles and everything else, computers, and of course, increasingly in the electrical vehicle side, we were depending on China for that. And we've seen how the disruption of that has affected manufacturing output more generally in many countries, including, of course, in the UK, where I'm speaking from. So there is a concern that if one is relying too much on a country which can indeed exert quite a lot of influence, on the speed of supply, if you like, or the amount of goods that people are getting elsewhere in the world, then that adds to economic insecurity. But it's also the question of maybe feeling that as China grows and comes back now, of course, into the trade situation again, because of course it's opened up post-COVID itself. What we may be finding is that indeed, as Europe expands and the West expands again, the demands on imports from China are, if anything, going to be increasing. And there is indeed, as we've just been hearing, this push to try and be a little bit more competitive against China, with a lot of emphasis now on subsidies and supporting one's own industry. There are now strategies for semiconductors galore in Europe. We've seen, of course, quite a lot of subsidies also on the green side in the US. So I think we are beginning to see some demarcation taking place between regions where there is actually going to be a lot more emphasis on supporting strategic industries, and also, of course, in ensuring that one is more competitive so that one does not rely so much on China and any of the political implications that may have.
Einar, we heard from our correspondent Katrina Yu in Beijing at the beginning of the program about the response there. I think she described it as furious. I mean, can you elaborate on that? Just how angry is Beijing at the G7 at the moment?
Well, I mean, for Beijing, it's, the sense of hypocrisy. Here you have the U.S. talking about economic coercion when it was the U.S. who's been, in the past, put unilateral sanctions on other countries, friend, foe, and neighbor alike, and it still has them in effect. It's the U.S., they say, well, the U.S. Says that we're somehow impinging on the South China Seas. They don't talk about the Monroe Doctrine, which apparently is being revived. So there's this real sense that the U.S. is being very hypocritical, that this is simply a power play by the U.S. to try to maintain its hegemony, kind of getting its old gang together, the G7, to support it in this kind of idea of maintaining U.S. supremacy. The fact is the G7 is basically an anachronism. It wasn't able to deal with the financial crisis that had to be done by a wider group, the G20. It has made a lot of promises. And if you look over the joint communique, there's a lot of talk, but very, very little action, And quite frankly, they've lost a lot of credibility, especially in the developing world, the global South. There's been all these promises of $100 billion a year. Only a fraction of it has come forward for climate change action. Now they're promising $600 billion for infrastructure. But it's kind of hard to believe that these countries are going to put other countries' infrastructure above their own. For instance, in the U.S., things are crumbling. So yes, Beijing is kind of not happy. It seems that every time the U.S. gets together with somebody, it's an attack on China.
Stephen, as Einar mentioned there, is the U.S. being hypocritical?
Every country is hypocritical, particularly in all of their public statements. I mean, to go back to the Monroe Doctrine, that's fine. That's a couple hundred years ago. But the Chinese have also, as we all know, decided to ignore international court rulings about the South China Sea. China is doing a lot of industrial espionage. China is building a very powerful navy. China is building nuclear weapons to double its stockpile. China is preparing, at least, to encircle Taiwan when it chooses to. And America's allies in the Pacific are anxious. They're anxious about Xi Jinping's aggressive tone and China's domination of certain key raw materials. So hypocritical, sure, everybody's hypocritical. That's not really the point. The point is whose interests are at stake and who's trying to protect them. And the United States does have allies, and China has Russia, and that's about it.
Stephen, you mentioned earlier that, US still being the major dominant superpower at this point in time. Does that force the EU to fall into line with its foreign policy? Obviously, we've seen it against the war in Ukraine. Are they basically, is Biden and the US forcing its foreign policy against China down EU's throat?
I think that's a little strong. I mean, the U.S. is obviously leading Europe and NATO's effort to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. That is for sure. That has increased U.S. influence, to be sure. But it is also true that the European Union, for the last 5 years, I would say, has been increasingly conscious of the threat China poses to European trade, to European intellectual property, and is conscious, as it was of its own dependence on Russia for energy, of its dependence on China for key materials. So it's trying to reduce this dependence. There's this ugly term, de-risking. But, I mean, the fact of the matter is there is a feeling China's not playing by WTO rules, though nobody is really anymore. and one feels a kind of economic nationalism increasing, both on the part of the United States, on the part of the EU, but certainly also on the part of China. This whole notion that all trade is good for everybody seems, Vicky Pryce might agree, to be less popular now than it used to be.
As Stephen was talking about there, the word of the day is de-risking. I mean, economically, what sort of impact is it going to have? And I mean, surely any de-risking is going to take years.
Indeed, it's going to take years. And the question is, what do you do in between? Because you clearly have to keep reasonable relations with China, because one still needs to import quite a lot. And also, of course, we mustn't forget that the EU exports rather a lot to China as well. So it is a two-way trade. So there are benefits, mutual benefits in keeping that going. But of course, there are rules that are already having an impact. So sectors which are considered now to be strategic, which were not considered strategic before, a lot more concern about the purchase of organizations and companies by China entities, where there is a lot more emphasis on looking at the governance of whoever is buying whatever organization in Europe. Of course, it's been already happening in the US. So there's restriction on where, you know, some of the Chinese companies can be involved, like in the telecom sector, as we've seen recently. At the same time, of course, one still wants to be able to export and to have access to various areas in China. And in some ways, those have been opened up in the last decade. And the last thing I think that a number of Europeans would want is for that to become more difficult. Of course, there is always a concern about IP and technical espionage, but we have seen, and this is really where a bit of the contradiction goes as a result of everything we've seen recently. We've seen the Chancellor of Germany going to China quite recently and looking at possible ways of, if anything, sort of improving some of the trade and investment links. So that has to continue, I would say, over a period of time while this de-risking takes place, because you're quite right, it cannot be done overnight.
And I don't imagine that China is going to sit idly by while all this happens. I mean, we heard a little bit of the rhetoric response from Beijing. What can or will it do from here? I mean, are we talking sanctions? What's the next move by Beijing?
Well, hopefully they don't respond tit for tat. I mean, Stephen, advocates this kind of amoral world where it's just whether you have a gang of friends or not, which makes you right. He mentions the WTO, but it's the U.S. who is preventing the WTO from working because it refuses to allow appellate judges to be put in position so that they could rule on matters. In terms of what China's going to do, I think that they're doing it, and that is they're expanding the Belt and Road. If you look, the kind of opposite number to this was Xi Jinping's meeting with the 5 countries of Central Asia. Very successful, concrete plans put in, money actually committed, projects developed, versus, this Hiroshima, the site of one of the worst man disasters in history. A reminder of the evils of war, and what you have are basically countries that are saying, well, maybe war is necessary. I mean, they're ratcheting up pressure, trying to put countries in a corner. I don't think it's very helpful, but I don't think that China should respond to it. I mean, it's just silliness. As I said, the G7 is now an anachronism.
Stephen, as we've talked a little bit about the South China Sea and Taiwan, what interest does the EU have in that region at all? And why is it, or should it be getting involved in that?
Well, first of all, it has trade routes and it wants to protect them. The French have citizens, don't forget. I mean, the French has part of France is in the Pacific. And these countries have ties, long-standing ties, century-old ties to the Pacific region. So it's not somehow getting involved. It's just keeping involved in a part of the world that is rising, that's getting richer, that is very important to the West, all of the West, in terms of trade, but also in terms of working ideally together to face issues like climate change and other problems that really are global problems. So nobody wants this kind of division that gets hostile. There is just a sense that China is beginning to push outwards in ways that damage other people's long-standing interests, and the Europeans, like the Americans, are responding.
Vicky, as Einar mentioned, sort of touched on a little bit earlier, we've seen recently more and more countries starting to pull away from the US and Europe. Pacific Island nations that have been wooed by China and many countries in Africa as well. Do you think that is because of China's, I guess, more aggressive take on things, or is it the US and the West's complacency and just assuming that they would always be allies?
Well, the real problem, I think, for a number of developing nations which have accepted sort of infrastructure money from China is that they're now at the point where they have to look again at their debt situation. And of course, COVID has made that considerably worse. So what is going on right now, of course, is the World Bank, IMF, and the Western donors, if you like, also considering rescheduling, maybe debt forgiveness and so on. So what we're seeing is that at least those are the reports. And China gives a very good explanation for why they don't want to be doing the same, because, of course, they've been lending right now at normal interest rates, which, of course, have gone up. They're concerned more about the financial sector in China, what would happen if, indeed, we had all those forgiveness sort of agreements going forward. So they're not playing ball, or at least that's the belief of the West, that they're not playing ball. Well, of course, that does in some ways tie quite a lot of the countries to China. On the other hand, it's obviously making it obvious that perhaps the financial arrangements they've come to are not particularly beneficial for them. And as we know from the past, what tends to happen is if there are issues on the debt situation with some of these countries, then China either takes some of those entities over or gets much more involved in the running of the country. So that's basically one of the concerns of the economic coercion, if you like, if you want to call it that. It's a slightly different definition to the normal one. Is worrying. So that, I think, is what may be the issue here, in addition to considerations of where are we perhaps safest in terms of whatever may be happening with geopolitics in the future.
Just before we finish up in a few minutes, I want to talk about the war in Ukraine, because obviously that is a major impact on relationships between all of these countries. Einar, I mean, it appears at this point in time that China is siding as sort of closer links with Russia than Ukraine. I mean, that's got to have had a major impact on the relationship with the EU, with the G7 and with the US.
Well, I mean, China's been having a good relations with Russia for quite some time. It's increased, obviously, because Russia's been cut off from the West. Yes, so, it's like water. It goes where it can go as opposed to where it can't. In terms of how that's regarded, I mean, from China's perspective, Beijing has said that they're neutral, that they want peace. And right now, they're proving it. They're the only one out there trying to say that, peace is necessary. The U.S. throwing more bombs at this, the Europeans insisting that because this war is in their backyard, it's a moral imperative that the world support it. Global South probably doesn't feel as strongly about that, since they've had continuous wars since 1945, regime change operations by the U.S. And, they say, gee whiz, it wasn't a moral imperative when it was a war in our backyard. So what you see is the Global South, Central Asia, with China, ASEAN, kind of moving in their own direction, while the former colonial powers, represented by the G7, are lecturing people how to run their economies and run the world when their, economies themselves are in shambles. It's kind of ironic that China will grow over 5%, Europe under 1%, the U.S. barely above 1%, yet they feel entitled to tell everybody that they have a solution. Doesn't seem so.
Stephen, I want to get your reaction to how the war in Ukraine and China's relationship with Russia and how that is, I guess, strengthened since the war started, how that has affected what we saw at the G7.
Well, I would say China feels a little stuck. This no limits partnership, as the Chinese ambassador to the EU told me, is just rhetoric. No limits is just rhetoric. It is true that China, like Russia, wants to have a revision of the multilateral world order that the U.S. has been dominating since the end of World War II. That is absolutely true. But China, if it was told about the war coming in Ukraine, expected a quick war. It didn't expect this war. And it has been put in a very complicated position. It has refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, while at the same time insisting that it accepts Ukraine's international boundaries, including Crimea. It has made a fairly abstract peace proposal. Others have tried to do the same. The Saudis, African leaders, the Turks. At some point, there are likely to be negotiations, but it's not clear China's considered a sort of even-handed broker here. But I think China wants to make sure the war doesn't go nuclear, and it has so far not given Russia the military supplies Russia seems to have wanted. So I think China is trying to find the right balance. It doesn't want to break with Europe or with the United States, and it doesn't want its alliance with Russia to harm it. It also doesn't want Russia to lose in Ukraine, because that would destroy the whole idea of having this partnership in the first place. So I think for China, it's a very awkward moment in a war it expected to last a few months and not a couple years.
OK, Vicky, final question before we go. We've only got a minute or so left. Is the war going to trump trade?
Well, it may well do. We've seen that during this whole conflict, of course, in Ukraine, sanctions have increased considerably. The flows of trade have been affected without any doubt. So I'm afraid we are now almost accepting that the era of globalization is over. It's a bit of a shame in many ways. But yes, we need to rethink, I think, the global trade flows and where we go from here. OK,
it'll be fascinating to see how things play out. Thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Einar, Tangen, Vicky, Pryce and Stephen Erlanger, thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.